The fog hung low over the Ardennes, thick enough to swallow sound. Dawn hadn't yet broken, and the only movement in the valley came from the faint shimmer of exhaust rising from hidden engines. Inside one of those engines of war sat a woman no one knew existed, at least not officially. Her name was Lieutenant Evelyn Eve Hartman, a British-born gunner with eyes sharp enough to pick out a rifle barrel from 500 yards. She was 27, small-framed and quiet, so quiet her crew had started calling her Ghost. What they didn't know was that her silence wasn't shyness, it was focus. Eve had grown up around machines. Her father had worked on naval guns before the Blitz destroyed their workshop in 1940. When she volunteered for service, the Army saw a clerk. What they got was a marksman who could read wind like a language. She trained with the Auxiliary Territorial Service, first as a rangefinder, then as a ballistics instructor. But by late 1944, she'd been reassigned to a special experimental unit, an all-purpose Firefly crew operating in the shadow of the 11th Armored Division. On paper, she was attached for observation. In reality, she was their gunner. The Sherman Firefly was an ungainly beast, an American tank redesigned by the British to carry a gun that could finally pierce the armor of a tiger. Inside, space was a luxury. Every surface was cold steel, every sound amplified. Eve sat in her seat, headset pressed tight, waiting for the order to move. Her commander, Major Alan Reeves, a man with the voice of gravel and the patience of a saint, glanced down at her. "You sure you're up for this?" She looked up without blinking. "I'll shoot when you tell me, sir, not before, not after." He grinned. "That's what I like about you, Ghost, no chatter, no nerves." In truth, Eve did have nerves, but she hid them beneath precision. She knew the Tiger's gun, the 88mm KWK, could cut through them before she ever saw its muzzle flash. The Firefly's only chance was distance and surprise. Her job was to make the first shot count because they might not get a second. At 600 hours, the radio crackled with orders. "Advance to the eastern ridge. Intel reports a stalled German column near the bridge." Reeves gave the signal and the Firefly rumbled to life, treads grinding softly over frostbitten mud. The horizon glowed faintly pink. Snow drifted from the pines like dust. The air smelled of diesel and cold iron. They reached the ridge by 6:30. Below them lay a frozen stream, a wooden bridge, and a scattering of abandoned vehicles. A truck overturned, a jeep burned black, crates scattered like bones. Reeves raised his binoculars. "Looks clear." Eve didn't answer. She was staring through her scope, scanning the edges of the trees. Her breath fogged the glass for a second, then cleared. Something wasn't right. The angles were too neat, the silence too complete. She had seen this kind of stillness before, just before an ambush. "Hold," she said quietly. Reeves frowned. "What is it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she adjusted the focus on her sight inch by inch. The lens settled on a line of trees by the far slope. There, half buried in frost and brush, she saw it, a barrel barely visible, the faintest curve of steel reflecting dawn light. Her pulse quickened. "Tiger," she said simply. Reeves froze. "You sure?" "Positive, left tree line 400 meters, hull down." The crew fell silent. No one needed to be told what that meant. The Tiger was the monster of Europe, heavy, precise, unstoppable. If it fired once, Hector would be a smoking crater. Reeves exhaled slowly. "All right, gunner AP, target designated." Eve's hands moved like clockwork, the shell sliding into the breech, the sight aligning with the faint outline. Her breath slowed until even her heartbeat felt distant. She could barely see the target through the haze, just the suggestion of a shadow against white. "Wind 3 knots left," she murmured. The loader stared at her. "You can't even see it clearly." "I can." "Range?" Reeves asked. 400, elevation 2 degrees up. She waited for the next gust, counted the seconds between each. Then she did something no one else in the crew noticed. She took her finger off the trigger. Instead of firing, she waited. Her ears strained for a sound that only someone who lived inside engines could hear, the low cough of ignition. There it was, faint, distant, unmistakable. The Tiger was starting up. "Now," she whispered. The Firefly's cannon boomed, tearing through the stillness. The recoil rocked the tank backward. Through her scope, Eve saw the shell connect, a perfect hit under the turret ring, a flash of orange, then black smoke. The Tiger didn't fire, it didn't even move. The explosion that followed was short, silent in the snow. "Hit confirmed," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, almost detached. The crew erupted in cheers, pounding the armor. "You did it, Ghost. You bloody killed a Tiger before it even fired." Reeves grinned, shaking his head in disbelief. That was one shot, one perfect bloody shot. Eve pulled off her headset slowly. No such thing as perfect, sir, just timing. The radio came alive again, frantic. Enemy armor neutralized, confirm coordinates. Reeves responded quickly, but Eve wasn't listening anymore. She was watching the smoke rise from the trees, curling upward like a ghost leaving the earth. The silence that followed was suffocating, a silence she had created. Hours later, they approached the wreckage. The Tiger lay half embedded in the frozen mud, its turret ripped open. The German crew hadn't stood a chance. The sight should have felt like victory. Instead, Eve felt a chill crawl up her spine. The snow around the tank was littered with personal effects, a glove, a photograph, a ration tin. She stared at them for a long time before turning away. Reeves walked beside her. Don't carry it, he said quietly. You did your job, you saved us. She nodded, though she wasn't sure she believed him. That night when they camped near the bridge, she lay awake in the dark, staring at the condensation on the inside of the turret. The Firefly's steel hull amplified every sound, every creak, every whisper of wind, but all she could hear was the silence that followed her shot. She had won, yes, but something in that silence felt like it would never leave her. The next morning, the radio operator from command arrived with a message. Commendation for Lieutenant Hartman, he said, handing Reeves the paper, for exceptional marksmanship under combat conditions. Reeves smiled, clapping her shoulder. Looks like they noticed your silent shot, Ghost. She gave a faint smile. It wasn't silent, she said, it's still ringing in my head. Outside, the frost began to melt under a weak sun. The smoke from the Tiger's carcass still rose faintly in the distance. The war would move on, new battles, new names, but for one morning in a frozen valley, a single shot had stopped death before it began, and the woman who pulled the trigger would carry that silence for the rest of her life. By noon, word of the shot had already traveled farther than their tank could. The radio chatter carried it from ridge to ridge. Firefly on the western line took out a Tiger with one round, until it reached command posts that didn't even know a woman was on the gun. In a war full of chaos, any miracle spread fast. By the time Eve's crew returned to base, officers were already waiting, notebooks in hand, faces tight with disbelief. They asked the same questions over and over: how far, how certain, how sure. Reeves answered most of them, sparing Eve the scrutiny. But the brass had sharp ears and sharper curiosity. When one officer finally addressed her directly, "Lieutenant, what made you wait before firing?" She hesitated. "The engine," she said simply. "I heard it start." The man frowned. "At 400 meters through armor and fog." "Yes, sir." He exchanged a look with the others. "That would be highly unlikely." Eve said nothing. She had no proof beyond instinct, no calculation she could show on a map. It was just something she'd felt deep in her bones, like a vibration through steel. The colonel sighed, signing the report. "Very well, Lieutenant. Unlikely or not, it worked. Carry on." Outside, Reeves caught up with her. "Don't let them turn it into magic," he said quietly. "They'll never believe what they can't measure." She smiled faintly. "Let them think what they want. I know what I heard." The next day, they were sent north to support an infantry push near Bostonia. The snow had turned to slush, the roads thick with churned mud. The Tiger kill had earned them a strange sort of fame. Crews saluted as they passed, calling her the Ghost Gunner. Eve hated it. War didn't need heroes. Heroes died. That evening, their column halted near a burned-out village. The sun dipped low, turning the snow pink. Reeves leaned out of the hatch, scanning the road ahead. "Ambush country," he muttered. "We'll park till dawn." The crew settled into routine: rations, cigarettes, silence. Eve climbed down, checking the gun one last time. The metal was slick with condensation, the barrel still scarred from yesterday's recoil. She ran a gloved hand over it gently, almost like an apology. "You and me again tomorrow," she whispered. Sleep came in short bursts. Around midnight, she woke to a sound that didn't belong, a low mechanical growl in the distance. Not wind, not thunder. Engines, slow, heavy ones. She crawled to the turret, pressing her ear to the cold steel. "Tom," she hissed through the intercom, "wake up." Reeves' voice came back groggy. "What is it?" "Engines, more than one." He was silent for a second, then alert. "Everyone up, guns ready." They killed the tank's lights, the only illumination now the faint silver of moonlight on snow. The growl grew louder. Eve peered through the periscope, shadows moving between the trees, armor glinting. "2, no, 3 tanks," she whispered. "German models, looks like Panthers." The loader swore under his breath, "We're sitting ducks." Reeves was calm, range 500 closing slow. He thought fast, "They haven't seen us yet. If we fire first, we'll give away our position. We wait." Eve frowned, "If we wait too long, we'll be target practice." He didn't answer. The air inside the tank grew thick with tension. The faint hum of the Firefly's idling engine felt deafening. Eve's finger hovered near the trigger, every nerve screaming. Then she heard it, a small clatter, metal on stone, someone outside. She froze. Through the narrow slit of the vision block, she saw a German infantryman creeping toward them carrying a Panzerfaust. He stopped 10 meters away, crouching, ready to fire. Eve didn't think, she didn't wait for orders. She reached up, swung the turret, and fired the coaxial machine gun. The burst ripped through the night, cutting the soldier down before he could aim. The valley exploded with chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the trees as the German tanks opened up, their shells screaming overhead. The first shot landed short, throwing dirt over the Sherman's hull. Reeves shouted over the noise, "They've got our range gunner on the lead tank." Eve swung the turret again, heart hammering. She couldn't see clearly, just movement flashes, the outline of a Panther's hull. She adjusted elevation and fired. The shell hit the ground short, exploding in a cloud of smoke. Second shot. The loader slammed another shell into the breach. The smell of propellant filled the compartment. Eve exhaled once, steadying her hand. "Winds shifted," she muttered. "Half-right correction." The next shot hit true. The lead Panther erupted in flame, its turret blowing off like a lid. "Hit confirmed," the gunner shouted. But there were two more. The second fired almost immediately, the shell smashing into the stone wall beside them. Fragments tore through the air, ringing off the armor. "Driver, move," Reeves yelled. Davies gunned the engine, throwing the Firefly into reverse. Mud splattered the periscope, obscuring Eve's view. "I've lost sight," she called. "Blind shot 40 left," Reeves barked. She aimed where instinct told her the second Panther would be. Fired, waited, nothing, then a soft, dull boom and a distant scream of metal. "You got it," the loader shouted. Only one remained. The third tank backed into the woods, its engine whining in retreat. Eve lowered her weapon slowly, breathing hard. The silence that followed felt strange, too sudden after the roar. Reeves rested a hand on her shoulder. "That makes 3 tanks in 2 days, Ghost. You're making the rest of us look bad." She gave a small, tired smile. "I just listen harder than they do." They stayed awake till dawn, watching the horizon. When light finally returned, it revealed the wreckage of 3 German machines scattered across the valley, black smoke twisting into the pale sky. Command would call it another victory, another miracle of precision. But Eve knew better. Each shot had felt less like triumph and more like survival by instinct alone. Later that morning, a military correspondent arrived to photograph the scene. He asked Reeves to pose by the smoking Panther, but the captain refused. "Get the gunner," he said, nodding toward Eve. She stood awkwardly beside the Firefly's barrel while the camera clicked. "Give us a smile, miss," the reporter said cheerfully. She didn't. "There's nothing funny about silence," she replied. The photo would run in newspapers a week later under the headline, "The Ghost Gunner Who Never Misses." Eve never saw it. That night she sat on the hull, watching snow fall on the burning machines. The battlefield looked peaceful again, almost beautiful, but in her ears, the echoes of those engines still hummed, faint mechanical ghosts that refused to fade. The morning frost clung to the barrels of the guns like a shroud, glinting under a sky too pale to be hopeful. The battle near Bastogne had ended in smoke and silence, but news of the ghost gunner didn't die there. It traveled like rumor always does in war, quick, distorted, and larger than truth. By the time Eve's crew returned to the divisional camp, she was no longer just a name on a roster. She was a myth. When they arrived, photographers were waiting again. Officers she'd never met came forward to shake her hand, their smiles wide but eyes curious, as though trying to glimpse what kind of creature could see through fog and fear. One even said, half joking, "You must have night vision in those eyes, Lieutenant." She only nodded, offering the polite, distant smile she had learned in childhood when men underestimated her. Inside, she felt nothing. The applause sounded wrong, too loud, too alive for the kind of silence she carried. That evening, Reeves was summoned to HQ. When he returned, he looked older, his jaw tight. "Command wants you in London," he said. "War Office interview. They're talking about propaganda value posters, morale broadcasts, all that nonsense." Eve frowned. "I didn't join to be a slogan." I told them that, he said, but they're not asking, they're ordering. 2 days later, she was flown out of France in a transport plane filled with reporters and officers bound for home leave. For the first time in months, she wasn't surrounded by steel or smoke. The air smelled of coffee, not gun oil, but it didn't feel safe. She lived too long listening for engines and explosions. Now, the silence above the clouds felt like the pause before another shot. When they landed, London seemed unrecognizable. Streetlights glowed again. Buses clattered down roads lined with faces that looked forward instead of down. People laughed. She couldn't. They called her a hero before she even stepped off the runway. Flashbulbs burst in her face as a reporter shouted, "Miss Hartman, what went through your mind when you destroyed that tiger?" She answered softly, "I stopped thinking." It wasn't the answer they wanted. The newspapers printed it anyway, twisting it into courage instead of exhaustion. The calm of courage, woman gunner who outthought the enemy. They made her sound like a storybook soldier, not a person who couldn't close her eyes without hearing the echo of cannon fire. The War Office scheduled an interview on the BBC. They gave her a pressed uniform and a small bouquet of flowers for the broadcast room. The host, a man with the polished tone of theater, smiled as he leaned toward the microphone. "Tonight, listeners, we bring you the story of the woman who fired the shot heard around Europe." Eve sat still, hands folded tightly in her lap. The host continued, "Lieutenant Evelyn Hartman, you've been called a miracle marksman. What's your secret?" She looked at the microphone, at the reflection of her pale face in the glass. "There's no secret," she said quietly. "I did my job before someone else could do theirs, that's all." The host blinked, uncertain how to follow. "And when you saw that tiger tank, what did you feel?" "Cold," she said, "and afraid, mostly afraid." He laughed awkwardly, trying to lighten the moment. A modest answer from a true British heroine. But the look in her eyes stopped him from saying more. She wasn't modest, she was haunted. After the broadcast, she walked out into the London night, snow falling softly through the street lamps. The city had survived the Blitz, its people still carried that strange mix of pride and sorrow. She felt both and neither. Every car backfiring on the street made her flinch. She turned down a quiet alley and leaned against a wall, breathing hard. The war was still in her, even if the papers said it was over. 2 weeks later, the army called her back to the continent. The Germans were collapsing fast, but intelligence reports spoke of one last armored division regrouping near the Ruhr. Reeves met her on the airfield. "Couldn't stay out of trouble, could you?" he said with a tired grin. She gave a small shrug. "Trouble's the only thing that knows my name." They climbed back into Hector like slipping into old clothes. The tank smelled of oil, cordite, and memories. The crew was quieter now, war-worn, cautious. They didn't cheer when she returned, but their eyes softened with the kind of trust only earned through survival. Their orders were simple but deadly: advance along the river road and cut off enemy retreat routes. But Eve knew there was no such thing as simple. The tiger she'd killed still visited her dreams. She woke some nights hearing the faint cough of its engine, seeing the flash that ended it. That image had burned itself behind her eyes. She carried it like a second shadow. The column moved out before dawn. The air was clear, brittle, cold. The world looked clean again, like war had never touched it. That illusion shattered when the first artillery shell landed a few hundred yards ahead. "Incoming!" someone yelled over the radio. Reeves ordered a halt. Through her sight, Eve saw it, a line of German armor retreating across a bridge half-shrouded in smoke. 4 tanks, maybe 5, moving slow but deliberate. One of them bore the familiar broad muzzle of a tiger. Her breath caught in her throat. "Tiger ahead," she said. Reeves' voice stayed calm. "You've done it before." "Doesn't make it easier," she murmured. They waited for the perfect angle. The lead tank moved onto the bridge, the others closed behind. If they destroyed it there, they'd trap the rest. But the range was long, the wind cruel. Reeves hesitated. "Too far." Eve adjusted the scope. "Not for me." She fired. The shells screamed across the valley, disappearing into the haze. Seconds later, the bridge erupted in fire and debris. The tiger vanished in a bloom of smoke, the structure collapsing beneath it. The crew cheered. Reeves exhaled, stunned. "You're mad, you know that." "Maybe," she said softly, reloading, "but I'm still here." The retreating tanks scattered, some burning, some fleeing. The river below ran black with oil. The air filled with the smell of iron and victory that didn't feel like victory at all. That night, as they camped beside the ruins, Eve sat alone on the tank's deck. The stars were bright for the first time in months. The loader came over with a flask. You did it again, Ghost, another tiger one shot. She took the flask, drank, and handed it back. They always say it's just one shot, but they never ask what it costs. He frowned. What does it cost? She looked out across the dark water. Sleep. When the surrender came, it wasn't a celebration. It was a breath held too long, finally released. The men didn't cheer, they simply stopped moving for a while. As if their bodies couldn't quite believe that the noise was gone. For the first time in years, there was no command to follow, no distant rumble of artillery in the air. The world was still, too still. Eve Hartman sat on the hull of Hector, staring across a valley that was already beginning to green again. The snow had melted into shallow pools, reflecting the sky in pieces. Behind her, the crew was packing equipment into crates. The war had ended on paper, but it hadn't left them yet. It would take months, maybe years, for the sound of engines and shells to fade from their bones. Reeves climbed up beside her, his cap crooked, his expression unreadable. "They say it's over," he said. She nodded slowly. "They've said that before. This time it might stick." "Maybe." They sat in silence for a while, watching smoke rise lazily from a distant village. The smell of oil and iron hung faintly in the air, the perfume of an age that refused to die. Reeves glanced at her. "London's been asking for you again, something about interviews, medals, maybe a documentary." "I'm not going." He chuckled softly. "Didn't think you would." She turned to him, eyes shadowed but steady. "I've had enough people turning what I did into something noble. There's nothing noble about shooting first." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "No, but sometimes it keeps people alive, that's enough." By summer, the crew was disbanded. The Fireflies were hauled off to scrapyards, their engines drained and silenced. When they came to collect Hector, Eve stood beside it, one hand resting on the scarred steel. "You earned your rest," she whispered. The machine said nothing, but in her mind she could still feel the faint vibration of its heart. She returned to England in June, to a London that was rebuilding faster than memory could keep up. Buildings rose from rubble, lights glowed again, music drifted from pubs, people smiled in the streets, but Eve couldn't join them. The sound of laughter felt strange in her ears, like a language she no longer spoke. She rented a small room near the river, where the hum of passing boats reminded her of engines idling in the dark. For a while, she worked as a driving instructor for demobilized soldiers. It paid little, but it gave her something steady: machines, motion, control. She kept her medals in a drawer, her uniform in a box under the bed. She never mentioned her nickname. When people asked what she'd done during the war, she said maintenance and changed the subject. Occasionally, letters would arrive from former crewmen. Reeves wrote from time to time, describing his new life running a garage in Wales. "Sometimes I still hear your shot," he said in one. "The one that stopped the tiger before it fired. I think about how close it all was, and I wonder if we'll ever be that alive again." She never wrote back, but she kept the letters folded neatly in a tin box. Years passed, the newspapers moved on to new wars, new faces. The legend of the ghost gunner faded into half-remembered footnotes in military journals. A single photograph survived, Eve standing beside her Firefly, snow on her shoulders, face unreadable. Occasionally, a historian would mention her, the unidentified female gunner whose shot destroyed a tiger tank before it could return fire. No one knew where she went after 1945. In truth, she stayed right where she was. Decades later, in the quiet of her flat, she could still recall the exact sound of that first engine coughing to life, the tiger's growl beneath the snow. It haunted her not because it frightened her, but because it reminded her of what she had taken from the world. A second of sound that never became a shot. In the winter of 1978, a letter arrived from the Imperial War Museum. They were restoring a Firefly for exhibition and wanted to verify details about the female gunner's engagement. She read it slowly, then set it aside. That night she walked down to the river, the same stretch she had walked past for 30 years. The city lights shimmered on the water like ghosts. She imagined the tiger again, the fog, the silence. That single moment when instinct decided the fate of strangers. She wondered whether the men inside the tank had families waiting for them too. When she died the following spring, the papers barely noticed. Just a small obituary: Evelyn Hartman, 69, former member of the Royal Armoured Corps, decorated for gallantry. There were no photographs, no mention of the nickname that had once traveled through battlefields like a rumor of hope. But the museum didn't forget. The Firefly they restored was placed on display under a skylight, its armor gleaming under soft light. On the turret, engraved in brass, were the words, "Lieutenant Evelyn Eve Hartman, the Ghost Gunner." Her silent shot destroyed a tiger tank before it fired once. She never called it courage, only timing. Visitors often paused there, drawn by the simplicity of the plaque. Some would look closer at the old black-and-white photograph mounted beside it, the woman standing in the snow, her eyes calm, her mouth set in something between a smile and a warning. Most passed by without knowing the story, but a few lingered long enough to feel the weight of the silence that had followed her everywhere. And on quiet afternoons, when the museum was nearly empty, the air inside the hall would hum faintly, the pipes, the glass, the breath of the city outside, until it almost sounded like an idling engine waiting for one more order that would never come.